Thank you so much, Colin. I think this was very insightful. You explained what voice of customer is, why is it important, and helped us think through the initial building blocks of how one can set up voice of customer.
The key thing is whoever is owning voice of the customer data has to be someone, voice of the customer program has to be someone who is very good with data and has some awareness of data systems.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the CX Files, the podcast where we get to you the best professionals from the field of CX, sharing their knowledge, their best practices, their experiences in CX so that we can make our own customer experiences better. Today, we are going to talk about managing voice of customer. What is voice of customer? Why is it important? And how do we go about setting it up? And to talk to us about that, we've got Colin Crowley, who's the Vice President of Customer Support at the Maven Clinic. So welcome, and Colin, thank you for making time.
Thanks, Sumit. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Colin, you want to spend like 15 seconds giving a little introduction to yourself, and then I'll add a little something on why I thought you were the perfect person to talk to about voice of customer.
Okay, great. So let's say I've been in the customer experience space over 15 years at this point, mainly spending my time growing and scaling customer support teams, sometimes in fast-paced startup environments, and especially in those environments, I would say. And it's ranged from smaller teams to about 350 people globally. And I've been in different industries. So I was the AVP of consumer transactions at a ticket marketplace called Ticket Network, and vice president of customer experience at a food tech company called Freshly, and head of customer experience at a fintech company. And I was in the software space as well for a period of time. And now, like you said, I'm in the healthcare space as vice president of customer support at Maven Clinic. So kind of been here, there, and everywhere in customer experience.
And that's exactly why I think you're just the right person to talk about voice of customer, because you've looked at various industry verticals, you have looked at industries at various stages of maturity, you've looked at companies at various stages of their own maturity. So fantastic. I'm so glad we found you through our research, and I think you're going to be the right person to talk about voice of customer. So before we go any further, for our audiences, can you just explain what voice of customer is? It's the most basic question. I know for you it's level 0, but let's start there. What is voice of customer?
I think you most simply define it as a process, and it is a process when it comes to cultivating, understanding, and analyzing how your customers think and feel about your company in the broadest sense. So not just the product, but the service generally, and how that adds value to their lives.
Yeah, and why do we bother? Why should a company bother about voice of customer?
I think now it's especially important because, as different industries get more and more crowded, it seems sometimes a cliche to say that customer experience is a differentiator, but it really is a differentiator. And I think more and more companies are recognizing the centrality of customer experience. And I think that's kind of moving away from an older model where in the past, the extent to which you may have cared about your customer's experience, it was kind of huddled around the actual product or service you were delivering. So if you were delivering a product in a technical sense, then customer experience was how the customers interacted with the product. And even to this day, you see a lot of software companies that just kind of focus on that as customer experience, as opposed to looking at a broader perspective that the customer experience starts from when they hear about your company and the rumors online and how that conditions them to have certain expectations, or the experience they have when they look at your website or your app, or when they contact customer support, or if you're receiving a physical good, how that experience is, even from like getting the package and unboxing it. So customer experience is broader, and that's very, very difficult when you think of customer experience in a broad way to understand what do you value and what do you prioritize and so forth. And the voice of the customer is really enabling you to be smarter about what you prioritize in terms of improvements and efficiencies to your company generally. So your product or your service and so forth. So without that insight, it's very hard to be strategic about what you target for improvement. And when you're in a highly competitive atmosphere, choosing what to target for improvement can make a big difference as to whether you're successful or not.
Fantastic. So what I'm hearing is that customer experience actually starts before this person actually becomes a customer, right? you're saying that even at the awareness stage, at prospecting stage, you're measuring their voice so that you know what they're thinking, and maybe guide them through that process so that whatever your customer journey, that golden path is traversed without deviation as far as possible.
Yes, and I would say that the voice of the customer, I mean, I would say really starts before someone necessarily is a customer, because you learn a lot from people who aren't customers, and sometimes you learn from them because they don't become customers. So if someone is a prospect and they're surfing your website, and you're trying to understand why don't they convert versus someone else who does convert, or what are certain behaviors of someone who does convert that is encouraging them to convert. So that all tells you about the value you're providing, the customers you actually have, and how you could potentially expand that expanse and provide more value and therefore have more customers from that. So yeah, I think customers kind of broadly, or maybe you can even define it as consumer, but that doesn't work so much in a B2B context. But I think it's above and beyond the actual customer after the customer is converted.
And so voice of customer is great. What are we listening for?
Well, I think all sorts of things. So I think one thing is technically, even though we say voice of the customer, I would say it's really voices of the customer. And what I mean by that is that there are many different ways that customers speak to you. And I think one of the challenges a lot of companies have is they think of voice of the customer as like surveys. So they have a more limited view of how you get the customer voice. And so and that's even true of the way a lot of software providers, I think it's fair to say, position themselves in the voice of the customer space. And they're probably heavy on the survey front. And surveys are great. So they're one way of getting the customer's voice, but there are various other ways customers speak, and it may not be audible speech. So for instance, the behavior of customers is a form of voice. So if your customer is engaging a lot with your website or your app, then that indicates that there's something about that that's attractive to them and interesting to them. So you can look at how they're clicking, for instance, through your website to understand what's useful. So that's a form of the customer voice because the customer's telling you something. Or your customer's level of loyalty is a form of voice, because if they're staying longer with you, then it's because you're providing some sort of value. So you want to understand what is that value that's making them loyal. Or even things like customer contact data. So you have all the customers phoning you or emailing you or chatting with you. So mining that information for how customers are thinking and feeling. And then you have more structured live sources you may create, where sometimes you may have the ability to do things like advisory councils or focus groups, which can be a type of voice of the customer. And you even have like proxy voices of the customer. So taking people like your customer support agents who deal with customers all the time and inviting them into more discussions to provide a proxy voice to the customer, because they just have more inherent sense of what customers think and feel. So that in and of itself is another way of getting the customer voice. So that's why I say it's voices of the customer, because you can collect data across all those different areas. And the challenge is, how do you make sure that you have some central team that's collecting that data? Because often that data I'm talking about is either disparate, so it's not in one place where you can analyze it, or you may not be collecting it at all. So that's where you need a concerted focus on collecting that information, and also very mindfully finding ways to get more customer voice, and then having a central place where that can be analyzed. And that's what makes voice of the customer tricky.
No, that's fantastic. I think there are two very distinct themes that I want to actually talk to you that you just touched upon. One is the transition in voice of customer over last 15 years as you've gone through your career. And second are the challenges, the new challenges, the old challenges that we've faced with voice of customer. So let's start with the first question. So you talked about how a lot of people think voice of customer is about surveys, right? And to my mind, 15 years ago, because rest of the data like clicks and how you use a product was not as easy to measure, surveys were the best way to capture that data. And that's the legacy from where voice of customer is coming from. Unfortunately, a lot of our companies even today are stuck at that legacy. But in your experience in last 15 years, and you've seen and you've lived through that change, how has that changed? And I think you did touch a lot about that as well. And how does that vary around a tech company versus a healthcare company that you're working for, which might not have as much data through like online clicks and all? So how do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. So I think if you look 15 years ago, it's true that you were more focused on things like surveys, or in other types of companies, maybe like the focus group route, that sort of thing. Yeah. So those two methods have been around for a while. But you're right, because that was in a world that was less cyber focused, I guess you'd say, where, one of the benefits of the world that we live in now is that there's so many different things to track. So like you think of a traditional in-store retail experience, and a customer coming into your store, and how little you're actually able to track about how that customer is interacting with the store. So they could be wandering around or looking at this product or that product for a certain period of time that may indicate interest, but then they have second thoughts and so forth. And there's really little data relatively that you have as to that person's experience, versus when you take that same experience and you put it into a website experience, all that stuff is tracked. So you get a sense for how long the customer is, loitering over a certain product, as an example, which provides more opportunities not only to understand where there's interest, but provides more opportunities en masse to like ping them over live chat or something. So I think you're right that one of the big things that's changed is just the fact that more and more companies are living in the digital world, which provides a lot more opportunities to have these different types of voices of the customer above and beyond surveys and focus groups and so forth. I think the other thing is, with the rise of AI-powered technology, that provides even additional resources to do something more with the data you're collecting. So I think a lot of companies have been in the space where they can collect data in our new framework, but the challenge is like, what do you do with that data? So what do you do with all the data you're collecting about your customers' behaviors in your website or your app, as an example? And so AI-powered technology is a great way to take all this disparate data and analyze it and see trends and deliver insights to you, so you're not sitting there with a shovel trying to dig for the data, which is prohibitive. And that's what causes a lot of companies not to invest a lot in voice of the customer in a robust way, because it does require so much effort to get to the data that's buried under your feet. But AI is making it much more possible to surface that data to you. So I think those things are the two big developments. And in terms of like different verticals, I would say, as actually one of the interesting things is when it comes to doing voice of the customer, I don't think there's really much difference across verticals in terms of what the best practice is. So I think it's very similar strategies. But the biggest differences would be things like how highly regulated an industry is, because that can limit what you're able to collect and how you're able to collect. So it's certainly true of healthcare, where you have to be very careful what you're collecting from your customers, because of obviously privacy concerns. So that could limit what you're able to collect, or you have to be a little bit more creative about how you get that customer voice, and may have to use more proxy customer voices. And another thing is the legacy nature of a certain vertical. So the point you made that some verticals are kind of more legacy than others, where they're still using older systems. So that can prohibit you. And the type of customer too. So there's a difference between how you may collect data if you're a B2B company versus a B2C company. So you're more likely to find things like focus groups or advisory councils as a method of collecting voice of the customer in a B2B environment than you would in a B2C environment. So there are nuances like that as well. But I would say those are probably the three major things that create differences. And then outside those three main things, most voice of the customer programs, the best practices would apply equally across the board and across verticals.
In my experience, I think, and this is true for both B2B and B2C, even within those categories, it matters whether you're talking to an audience which is 18 years or an audience which is 60 year plus, because that fundamentally changes the way you go to, or what you go to ask. Similarly, in B2B, if you look at, and you've worked in both kinds of companies, so you can comment on that. But I've seen that the kind of questions that you can ask a tech savvy kind of audience versus a little more conservative, old world kind of industries like maybe metallurgy. I think the way you asked, what you ask, the channel that you use to ask, all of them, in my mind, have to be fine-tuned to make sure that you're getting the right kind of nuances.
Yes, and that kind of brings up the other point that I mentioned before. It's more like voices of the customer than it is voice of the customer. And that kind of pushes that even further into the plural space, because the point you're making, which is very true, is that it's in reality, it's voices of the customers, because not only are there different ways that you collect the customer voice, and you want to have those different ways, because if you're only collecting the customer voice through certain ways, then your information will be more biased, because it's more likely that certain people are taking surveys, right? Or only certain people are contacting customer support. So the more different voices you're collecting, the more you're getting a holistic view of customers. But there are also different types of customers. And you have to make sure that as you're collecting the voice of the customer, that you're taking into consideration all of those customers as well. So that's why at the end of the day, it's really voices of the customers. And so that adds just another level of complexity into making sure that you're being really thoughtful about how you build a voice of the customer initiative.
Fantastic. So, Colin, the ideal outcome of this discussion would be if the audience goes back and starts to think about setting up their own voice of customer programs inside their own organizations. So if they have to do that, what would you say are the basic building blocks? How do they get started?
Yes, well, I think probably the central thing is that you need an owner. So I think a lot of companies, when they're collecting information about their customers, they don't have a centralized person or really team you have to build. It could even be a very small team at first that's managing that collection. But you really need someone who is owning the process and is the person responsible for your voice of the customer initiatives, rather than trust product to be collecting stuff and customer support to be collecting stuff and marketing to be collecting stuff. Mm-hmm. So having an owner is really important. So having that person to manage the process. And I would say another thing is kind of where you position that owner. So ideally, you want to position that owner in a place that's as neutral as possible, because another problem companies have is if voice of the customer is owned by a certain organization within the company, like product or marketing, then not surprisingly, the collection mechanisms for getting the customer voice may be prejudiced towards getting the information that that particular organization wants. So I've been in cases where, for instance, like product thinks it really owns the voice of the customer, and the major point of that voice of the customer is to get information about the product, as opposed to thinking, well, wait a second, maybe people in marketing could get some really good information from customers, even about asking about their buying psychology as an example, or maybe there's some really great stuff that people over here in operations could get from voice of the customer. So being mindful about where you're positioning that owner as well, so that person is naturally in a role that is a collaborative one, which is one of the reasons why I would say more and more you may see more voice of the customer initiatives led from customer support organizations, or if you have a customer experience vertical at your company, positioning it in the customer experience vertical, where you're in a team that's already used to being at the nexus of a lot of different interconnecting teams. So those are two things I think that are really important to set things up organizationally.
Wouldn't that lead to a big challenge of how do you coordinate with them? I mean, marketing team or sales team, their KPIs are very different right now. How do you make sure that they collaborate, as you said, with this team that is measuring the voice of customer?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is you create some sort of structure, and it could be like a pod-based structure, but where you have an owner, maybe that owner has a person or two under them, but the owner kind of runs a council, let's say, or a working group that has representatives from different organizations across your company. So they have a special point of contact in product and in marketing and in operations and in customer support, or whatever the case may be, who are like the designated representatives from their particular group, and also people who are able to speak to what the collection mechanisms may be within those respective organizations. So that's kind of one thing. So you structure things organizationally. And another thing that you do is having, clear KPIs and clear end goals as to what you want to get out of the voice of the customer initiatives that you will be embracing. Because having those end goals helps to orient everyone around certain commonalities. And also helps to guarantee value to those different organizations. So if you know that the point of voice of the customer is that you're producing X and Y and Z, then that is kind of a guaranteed value you're giving back to the organization. So that's how I would kind of structure things. So it does need.
Who would this owner be reporting to in the organization?
Well, that depends on the vertical, but again, more and more companies have like a customer experience vertical. They'll have like a chief experience officer or chief customer officer or something like that. Okay. So I think that is a natural place. And it makes sense to have the voice of the customer in some area in your company that deals with the customer. So that does help because there's some intrinsic knowledge you have about kind of understanding how you engage with customers or how you can engage with customers if you're in a more customer-facing role or have someone who has customer-facing experience.
Yeah.
But I would simply say that customer experience vertical, or more and more again, customer support organizations, or sometimes you may have it even within customer marketing. So customer marketing within marketing organizations is another thing that's kind of expanding a lot. And you see a lot of blending between customer marketing. So things like advocacy, online community, and things of that nature. So like when I was at the company Freshworks, for instance, I led a team called the customer engagement team there, which was basically like an aggrandized customer marketing team. And we had advocacy, online community, learning and development, so like a customer-facing learning academy. And then we had a voice of the customer team. And we worked in conjunction with other people in marketing and customer support and product and so on and so forth. But because we had a more customer-facing role, it kind of made sense for voice of the customer to be owned by us.
And I think this is what distinguishes like successful customer experience teams versus the unsuccessful ones. If you are if you're not the same vertical, if you're not like from the marketing team or sales team, you are an external vertical. How do you convince the marketing team or sales team to feel like customer experience is my job, right? So, would you like to comment on that? How did you manage in your stints? How did you manage to get that culture of customer experience to seep through every vertical, even though you were not part of those verticals yourself?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say voice of the customer is one key way to do it, because one of the benefits of it, and this is where also as part of building a program, you have to build it mindfully to make sure that other organizations are getting value out of it. So like an example, when I was at Freshworks, that was in the B2B environment. But one of the things that we did is we had regular advisory councils of customers across our different products that would meet monthly for 90 minutes. And they were the same customers. And we ended up having 10 of them. So we were rotating around 150 customers every month going through these councils. And we made sure that the council meetings we met for like 90 minutes every month were chopped up into slots, and that we as leading voice of the customer gave slots to different teams. So marketing would have a slot, and product would have a slot. And operations would have a slot. So all these different teams knew they could get a guaranteed slot where they could use that to get feedback from customers on a regular basis. And that provided an avenue where these organizations recognized the value they could get out of being a part of the process. Because once people start to see the value of voice of the customer, then that's a really attractive way to get them involved. And by getting voice of the customer that's more specific to their respective area of concern, that also helps them to see the customer experience in a broader way. Because some challenges that we have is a lot of these organizations internally that you may have at your company, they may want more voice of the customer, but they don't know how to get it. And they're not institutionally set up to be able to hear from customers very well, aside from little comments you'll post from someone's customer support query or something like that. So a lot of these internal organizations, if you give them the opportunity to say, hey, we'll provide a guaranteed forum where you can regularly engage with customers, we'll take you up on that offer and we'll find ways to benefit. And that in turn makes them feel more connected to the customer experience, and through that makes them more aware of how much they impact that experience. So I think voice of the customer and having a very collaborative framework where you're guaranteeing a slot for these organizations in your company to participate is one great way of getting people to focus more on the customer experience.
Fantastic. So we've identified that there needs to be a customer experience vertical, and there needs to be an owner, and how is the team going to be set up. We've figured out that we need to be collaborative with other silos, other verticals inside the organizations. Now, imagine we've done all that, right? So now we have to get this voice of customer program off the ground, right? So how do we do that? What are we measuring? Who are we asking? How are we collecting information? How are we dissipating information? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I said that's where the tech stack comes in. So another key thing, it's just inevitable with everything being collected in the digital space that you'll need some sort of technological aid, because you could try to clobber together something manually, but it's just not going to work very effectively. So there are a lot of tools out there, AI-powered technologies that can do like widespread text analysis through different disparate sources. So you may want to look at those different types of technologies. So they can look at your customer support contact data, and sometimes it's manually uploaded, or you can do it through API, where you're also bringing in survey data as well. And you're also bringing in data from your focus groups, because maybe you have transcripts from your focus groups, which in turn can be added to these systems. So you can put all this data in text form into this software where analysis can be performed to identify trends. And typically what you can do from there is you may be able to do things like build separate dashboards. And this is where it comes back to, I guess, linking the tech stack with the value you provide other organizations in your company. But you could conceivably do things like build separate dashboards for different organizations in your company, because someone in marketing is going to have a different interest in the customer voice. So for instance, they may be interested every time your customers are mentioning a competitor as part of their competitive intelligence strategy, or they may be interested in people's complaints about online promotions or advertisements or something, versus people in product obviously are more interested in people's comments on the product. So you can kind of use these systems to create dashboards or a central place, or let's say you give access to these special points of contact in these different organizations, and they can go in there and use that dashboard or use that tool to get information on the fly whenever they need it. So the tech stack is important, because that's the way you can coalesce information in one place and make that information accessible. And a tech provider of some sort would also be able to run reports on the data too, in a way that's much more agreeable and visually pleasing. All right. Yeah. So it's much easier to create dashboards showcasing trends or increases in customer complaints in a certain area. So that's really the part about choosing a good vendor that's going to integrate very effectively with your pre-existing platforms as much as possible. And sometimes that can be tricky, because if you're doing like video-based voice of customer engagements, like we were at Freshworks, then you look at some providers that can analyze video calls, which there are more and more now. But I'd say the good news on the tech front is that with ChatGPT and OpenAI, a lot of that technology and generative AI is really helping democratize access to a lot of these systems, where you have a lot of systems now that will take that 90-minute meeting I just spoke about and be able to create an automatic summary of that meeting for you, or a transcript that's easily searchable, so that across 10 plus hours of meetings in a given month, it's actually a very searchable thing for people in product or marketing or operations to look through if they want to get insights. So the tech stack's really, really important in that regard.
Yep. So you touched upon this very early on this discussion about the challenges that lie ahead of us. One of the things that has happened is that it's become really easy for us to collect data. Like you said, video call, 1.5 hours, and now suddenly you have transcripts which are automatically generated. So if you have like 150 conversations or customer advocacy conversations that you were having periodically, you have all this data now sitting with you, right? There is somewhere in some corner, in some server sitting, that data is sitting. How do you make it accessible to the entire team in a way? And yes, you talked about dashboards as well, but sometimes you have to dig deeper than that, right? So sometimes you have to look for data that already exists. How can you make it accessible? Like you were talking about ChatGPT making it accessible to more and more people, but within the organization, who's going to be the ChatGPT here?
Yeah, well, this is something where, it can be very differently structured based on your organization, but I think that the key thing is whoever is owning voice of the customer data has to be the voice of the customer program has to be someone who is very good with data and has some awareness of data systems, because the ability to collect the information and disseminate it is just as important as anything else you do in voice of the customer. So I would say when you're looking for an owner, that is a key prerequisite. And that would mean that person has to work in close collaboration with any data team you have internally, or have their own resources for collecting voice of the customer data separately, even if it's like they have like one data analyst under them. So again, sometimes these things don't require a huge team or a huge effort. Yeah. So when I was at Freshworks, we had like 2 other people under me for voice of the customer, and we were able to do a lot of great things with just that high-powered group. Having that data focus is really important. And I think, and honestly, a lot of the problems that you're talking about are really solved by looking at these AI-powered third-party software solutions. But I do think that the big thing is having someone in that ownership seat who has an appreciation for where all the data is, and what other opportunities there exist to collect more data. So if anything, I think most of the challenge is in a failure of imagination in many companies, and a failure of understanding as to what data you have, and therefore where your gaps are, so what data you need. And when you have that down, then a lot of the rest is ultimately substantially, I would say, resolved by the new tech players and AI technology. But it's really more in the ideation phase, I guess you would say, where you see a point of failure, where you're just not starting out on the right foot, or you're not really appreciating all the different and disparate sources of information on customers. And that, again, kind of comes back to having that broader view of voices of the customer. I think that's where a lot of companies don't start off on the right foot, even if they adopt a technology platform to assist with data analysis.
Yeah, Colin, you're making it sound simple, but in my mind, what's going on is that look at the skill sets you require from this team or this person, right? So you need to be able to collaborate with all the teams. Okay, so you have to be collaborative. You have to make sure not just collaborate, but also convince people to sit with you, share their data. So product team to share their data, sales team to give you some kind of input so that you can create dashboards. You have to be a data maven as well. You need to understand what kind of data would actually lead to action, would lead to outcome. You have to take that information coming in, convert that into some kind of actionable data point that these guys can use. So you have to be a data scientist as well. You have to integrate so many technologies, so you better be savvy. You might not be the person writing the code, but you still have to be technically savvy to be able to evaluate what's out there and what would help and what would actually work for your organization. So in my head, yeah, maybe for a large organization, you can have 200 people and therefore have all these skill sets. But for a smaller organization, to get all these skill sets together under one team can become a challenge in itself.
Yeah, and I think, but what I would recommend there in that particular case is you don't, almost like what you're describing, I would say is like the endpoint. So the endpoint after a process of growing and maturing the voice of the customer program. But when you're looking at getting started, then you can stair step it. And in all honesty, because voice of the customer is a relatively new area, and to your point, it requires a lot of different skill sets. So it's actually a really good role for someone who may not have all the skills starting out, but a good growing opportunity for them. And as long as they have some certain central skills in at least 2 or 3 of those main areas you described, that's a really good starting point. And because voice of the customer does involve kind of getting out there and being very proactive, identifying opportunities to listen to customers and so forth, looking at someone who's very creative in terms of how they address challenges, and someone who's very much of a go-getter, and also someone who has an intrinsic understanding of customers. Those qualities can really be enough even to start the program. And you can just start it with one person. And you stair step it. So you think to yourself, what's the first rung of the ladder where I want to start collecting the customer voice? And probably one of the easiest ways to do that would be surveys, because surveys usually are some way you can build them into your customer support platform. So either you launch those, or maybe you look at the surveys you have and you think, maybe we can be a little smarter with these surveys, or try to survey customers at different points of their experience rather than just having one main survey at a certain time, as an example. And then the next natural rung is to look at the customer support information you have, because everyone's having customers contact them. So that's data that if you're not using it, you can easily find an opportunity to use it with some of these tools I described, or do some manual analysis starting out. But those are 2 rungs of the ladder. And then maybe you just take those 2 rungs and you start to collect data, and then you start to find, how do I present this in an agreeable format that's kind of digestible for other people in the organization. Yeah. And then you create some mechanism for sharing it. And you create some mechanism, maybe it's in an all hands meeting or in a quarterly meeting or something. And that way you're kind of showcasing how that voice of the customer provides value. And you actively look for opportunities to say, hey, here's some great feedback from our product people. And sometimes even doing things like getting like video testimonials from customers, anything that's very visceral like that can help. But if you start in that way, that's a way where you're kind of building things up bit by bit, starting with things that are kind of easier to do and more obvious, because some of the behavioral tracking stuff is harder, and like focus groups take more effort. So you start with the easier things like surveys, contact data, etc. Find ways you can package that, demonstrate the value, through that, get more buy-in from people who say, oh, actually, we can make use of this information, and get your CEO excited. And then there you can get a little bit more buy-in bit by bit to say, okay, now let's expand this a little further to here, to here, to here. And also by stair-stepping it, you're not biting off more than you can chew too early, where you may have questions about, okay, well, why are we investing so much in this, and what's the ROI behind it? Because you can incrementally showcase the ROI as you're going. And you can kind of be thoughtful about how you're using company resources. So I would recommend a stair-step approach, and that owner, that voice of the customer owner, can grow as an individual throughout that process, and eventually reach a point where you have 1 or 2 people under you or something. Right. But I think you're perfectly sensible, if you're a smaller company, to choose someone and be very mindful about this being a growth opportunity for them.
Right, and it almost sounds to me like this is a classic COO or CRO kind of a track, where you have a holistic view of what your customers are talking about, and you are able to ingest information from various teams and then convert that into some kind of insights and send it back. So it gives you like a bird's eye perspective of what's going on in the organization, and it kind of if you start your career there and spend considerable amount inside an organization doing that, I think it basically readies you for a CXO role very, very quickly.
Yeah, I agree, because it's a great opportunity for someone because you get a lot of different perspectives from across any company. And it's a great opportunity to work with a lot of different organizations within a company. So career-wise, I think a voice of the customer role is actually a very attractive role, especially for someone whose career could branch out into many different directions. And to your point, it kind of naturally positions you ultimately to be a chief customer officer with a fuller definition of what that means, where chief customer officer increasingly in some companies, even combines like sales, support, and success, and all those things all together. So yeah, it puts you in an excellent position to be very competitive in a growing field that you see at a lot of companies.
Fantastic. So great. So now we're going to change some gears. We're going to get to the fun part of this podcast, which is the rapid fire question. We do this rapid fire at the end of every podcast. And this is about CX in general, not necessarily voice of customer. The only requirement is that the answers are going to be rapid. So, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Fire. Okay, then let's do this. Okay, so one word to describe perfect customer experience.
Clean.
Clean.
Clean, okay. As in streamlined, simple,
efficient.
Solitary.
Perfect.
Yes.
All right. The most important CX metric as per you.
QA score, even though you have to create it, but way to take quality into consideration. You can also include product and process in that.
Interesting. The brand that you admire most for customer experience.
My most is tricky. I will say one company I'm appreciative of has made, I think, a lot of big changes. Some of the travel companies like Expedia. When I've traveled a lot, used to be a hassle to change or cancel a flight, but now there's a chatbot there, and I can do it almost always through a chatbot, and it provides added value, because I know if I go to the airlines directly, it'd be a hassle. So I think it's a good illustration of added value through a third party.
Nice. What's the biggest myth about customer experience?
Very similar to what we talked about. It's really about customer experiences and appreciating how many different experiences customers have. And it's not just one, but it's making sure you have every single touch point included in your analysis.
So voice is not voice, as you said.
No.
Right? What's the future of customer experience in one word?
I think promising, with all the AI technologies and focus on customer experience broadly.
So you kind of trampled over my next question. One tool or technology that's a game changer for CX.
I would say within AI, agent assist technologies that empower agents, and so keep human beings, but allow humans to be more human at scale. We'll put it that way.
Okay. And what's the most challenging aspect of delivering a great CX?
I would say increasing quality and efficiency at the same time.
Oh, wow. Okay. Nice one. Okay. One book or resource that you would recommend to our audience on CX?
Interesting. I don't really have like one central book, but I will say what I found very useful is vendor newsletters. And the reason I say that is because up and coming software companies who have newsletters, they're thinking ahead as to what's happening in the future versus a Forrester or a Gartner, which is more looking at what's going on and what's just passed. So I would say find vendors you like and look at newsletters and their blogs.
Great. That's a great answer. Last one, the best piece of CX advice that you've ever received.
I would say go for the gold early. So the earlier you are and you can focus on getting really good KPIs, the better, because then you're kind of committing yourself to doing better in the future as opposed to thinking, oh, we'll get better later. Because once you start scaling, that doesn't happen. So when you go for the goal early, it's harder to go back from that. And it's a better way to hold your feet to the fire and be higher quality as you scale.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much, Colin. I think this was very insightful. You explained what voice of customer is, why is it important, and helped us think through the initial building blocks of how one can set up voice of customer. Really appreciate your time, your insights, and your guidance on this. And I hope you had a good time. I certainly did. So thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Sumit. It's really a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Take care, and we'll talk again sometime soon.
Thank you.
All right.